It's Soap Week, and at Simply Earth, we are filling up this week with a new soap recipe each day. And today, our soap is inspired by the Wisconsin woods, which is where we are located. To make this recipe, you will need 2 pounds of Simply Earth's Melt and Pour Glycerin Soap, Forest Green Mica Powder, Simply Earth's Lime Green Mica Powder, Black Mica Powder. You'll also need our 4-inch loaf molds. And we'll be using the essential oils timber and pine. And from your house, you're gonna wanna grab a spray bottle of rubbing alcohol or isopropyl alcohol and a small book. Let's get started. Our first step is to chop up our soap into 1-inch cubes. And we're not gonna quite use this whole 2-pound block. We're gonna use about 2/3 of this soap. For this recipe, we're going to be using 20 ounces of soap. If you have a scale at home, you can go ahead and weigh this out, but if you don't, this is about 2/3 of our block of soap. So I'm just gonna cut it into thirds. You'll wanna cut your soap using a non-serrated knife or a soap cutter like this. I'm gonna set this aside. I can use that soap in future soap recipes. So first step is to chop this up into 1-inch cubes. Boom, all chopped up. Melt and pour soap is really easy to cut. The reason we cut up melt and pour soap is to allow it to melt more evenly. So now what I'm gonna do is divide my soap into 3 equal portions because we're going to be using 3 different colors for our soap. Our first step is to take one of these portions of soap and melt it. I'm gonna set the other 2 portions aside. We're gonna use them later. Best way to melt and pour soap is in a double boiler over the stove. You can melt it in the microwave using short intervals, stirring in between each interval. For this video, I am melting it in the microwave, but if you are a beginner at soap making, I recommend using a double boiler. So I have my soap melted here, and it's in a pitcher that's easy to pour out of. And to this, I am going to be adding 7 drops of timber and pine essential oil, and a dash of black mica powder, all right. So this is the color I want. It's nice and dark, and I'm ready to do my first little pour. So for my first layer of soap, I'm just going to pour a small amount into the bottom of this mold. I'm then gonna spritz this with rubbing alcohol to get rid of the little bubbles. I'm now going to allow this to set a little bit while I melt my next chunk of melt and pour soap. So now to my melted soap base, I am going to be adding a dash of lime green mica powder and stirring it in. I'm also going to be adding 7 drops of each of these essential oils. I'm going to stir it until all the mica powder gets uniformly mixed in. And then before I pour it, I'm going to make sure that this layer is set enough to have this layer poured on top of it. To figure that out, you'll want to touch it with your finger, and if it holds underneath your finger, it's ready to be poured. And for this layer, I'm going to set this book underneath my mold so that it is slightly angled upwards, and this is gonna make our like pine forest kind of theme. All right, so I'm gonna pour another layer here, but before I do that, I gotta do something really, really important. I have to spray it with rubbing alcohol, otherwise this green layer is not going to stick to the black layer. When I take it out of the mold, it'll just fall apart, and I do that often, and it's very, very sad. So don't forget to do this. This is going to bind the 2 layers together. I'm gonna pour enough soap to cover that layer, and then again, I'm gonna spritz it with rubbing alcohol to get rid of those little bubbles that wanna form on top. So now I need to let this soap layer set, and then I'm gonna pour another black layer on top of it. So it's kind of like a sandwich. So once this is cooled enough so that there is a small layer of soap on top, you can pour another black layer of soap. You'll want to make sure this black layer isn't too hot, or it's going to break through that top layer of soap that has formed. on here and can hold underneath my fingertip. So I'm going to check the temperature of this. I want it to be between 125 and 135 before I pour it. And this is 126, so perfect. And I need to make sure that this layer is gonna hold underneath this black layer. So I'm gonna touch it with my finger to make sure that it can support that layer. Then I'm gonna spritz it with rubbing alcohol, because without it, the soap is gonna fall apart and be a sad, sad mess. I'm gonna keep it on the same slant on the book so that it's a sandwich of black, green, black. All right, so now I'm gonna spritz it with rubbing alcohol to get rid of those little bubbles on top and let this set while I melt this last section of soap. So I've got my last little portion of soap melted, so I'm going to be adding my essential oils again to this layer and a dash of forest green mica powder. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, plus a little friend. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Ooh, best. Okay. And a dash of dark mica powder. Stir, stir, stir. Stir, stir, stir. All right, I'm also going to slide my mold over this way. I'm gonna switch it so that my dark green is going the opposite direction. Spray it with rubbing alcohol so my layers stick together, because I don't want to be sad. And then I'm going to gently pour this layer on. And then I'm gonna spritz it with rubbing alcohol. So now I'm gonna set this aside, and now I'm gonna make another black layer. So my forest green is sandwiched between black layers. I'm gonna keep it on this same angle of books because it creates such a cool design this way. So now on top of my forest green layer, I'm gonna add another black layer of soap. All right, this black soap is cold enough to be poured onto here. And I am a little worried about messing up the layer, so I'm gonna hold it nice and close while I pour over it. And I'll set this black aside and we'll switch back to the lime green color. All right, so my black layer has cooled enough to support itself, so I'm going to flip my mold around and angle it this way. And I am going to gently pour this over, but first I gotta spray it. Don't forget to spray it, otherwise it's not gonna stick together. And I'm going to use up all my green. So this is gonna be a thicker layer. Spritz it with some rubbing alcohol to pop those little air bubbles that show up on top as the soap starts to cool. On top of my lime green layer, I'm gonna sandwich it with another black layer, pouring carefully to avoid disrupting the layer beneath, and also spritzing it with rubbing alcohol. So now I'm gonna pour my final forest green layer. I've switched my mold around, and then I'm going to carefully pour this on. Spritz it with rubbing alcohol. And then I didn't quite measure out my soap perfectly. I need a little bit more black soap to finish off this layer. I'm gonna cut up a little bit more soap, color it with black mica powder, and fill it the rest of the way once this layer has set. Once this layer has set, I'm gonna remove the book so that the soap is flat again, and fill it up the rest of the way with this black soap. So now the soap is complete. It just needs to cool, and we want it to totally cool. It's gonna cool along the outside first before the middle gets cool. So you'll wanna make sure that every part of the mold feels room temperature, sides and bottom, and then maybe just on the safe side, wait even a little bit longer to remove it from the mold. It'll probably take 2 to 3 hours to totally cool. Maybe a little bit less than that depending on your environment. So now our pine forest soap has cooled and I can remove it from the mold. This mold is gonna form an air seal around the sides of your soap. So to get it out, you'll first want to push out the sides like this, and then this side releasing that seal, and then you'll want to do the same thing from the bottom. You can even just tip it over. I'm going to press on it on my thumbs until I feel it moving away from the mold. Whew. All right, we got it out of the mold. And this is what it looks like before we cut it. So this is our pine trees and our pine forest soap. And it looks really pretty. So now I'm gonna cut my soap. You can measure it along the edges. So I'm going to make these bars be, and with my little soap cutter, I'm going to mark where I'm gonna cut. Here we go. And then I want to roll it off my blade like that. And it looks so pretty. It's sticking together so nicely. I rocked out spraying it with isopropyl alcohol between each layer. This is one of the practice soaps I did when coming up with this recipe. And you can see that the layers broke off. This is because I did not spray it well with isopropyl alcohol. I was experimenting with colors too, so you can see this is a little bit grayer. But remember to spray each layer with isopropyl alcohol, otherwise your pretty soap will be like this instead of this. So I just cut this soap into 5 beautiful bars of soap that you can gift, you can use yourself. So I'm gonna grab one of these bars of soap, get it a little bit wet to show you how it foams up. Creates a nice lather, really easy. This, super nice to wash your hands or body with.